This video is just a brief summary of what we did in class. So this week's reading is focused on the last one of Porter's 5 forces that we're going to look at, namely intra-industry rivalry. I'm going to claim that a central question here is the question of whether firms are going to cooperate or whether they're going to compete with each other in the way that we use the word compete or competition in everyday language. So the kind of industry that we're going to look at here is oligopolistic. It's got a few dominant firms. Could be as small as a duopoly. It could have a few firms or perhaps as many as 6 or 8 dominant firms. But the idea, of course, is that these are not necessarily the only firms in the industry. There could be some small ones there as well. But an oligopoly is dominated by a few large firms. And we could decide whether an industry was oligopolistic or not by just looking at the market shares that the largest firms have. Well, as I said, we've got two main possibilities here. The firms may cooperate in some way, or they may compete. They may compete through price competition or through product differentiation in some form. If they cooperate, that cooperation could take a variety of forms. It could be overt collusion, it could be tacit collusion, which we'll be looking at later, or it could be some way of dividing up the market into different parts or different segments where each firm has its own territory. Well, in the lecture, we had a look at a simple model due to a French economist from the 19th century named Bertrand. And that particular model had a kind of special feature, or a set of special features. It featured just 2 firms that produced an identical product, and they had to choose a price for their product. And that price could range anywhere from the monopoly price to what I call the competitive price. That is a price that would just cover their costs. Well, I made an argument that the equilibrium in this market, the price that was going to end up resulting, was going to be the competitive price. And essentially the logic was that the 2 firms were offering identical products, their buyers were perfectly informed and cared only about price. So each firm would have an incentive, no matter where the price was, to undercut the other firm. So each firm had to charge the same price, and given that each one has an incentive to choose a strategy that cuts the price further, if it's not already right at the bottom, the only place that prices can end up is at this competitive level. So this is a story where, really by assumption, the firms can't cooperate. The equilibrium that results here can also be called a Nash equilibrium. So, expressed in very general terms, that's just a situation where neither person, neither party in a strategic situation has any incentive to change their strategy given what everybody else is doing. So if I just go back to the previous case, if I go back to the previous case here, if we're both at a price like this, each firm has an incentive to cut its price a little bit, take the whole market away from the other firm, and then the other firm is going to match that price and there'll be an incentive to cut the price further, and we'll end up down here. But once we reach the competitive equilibrium, nobody has any incentive to cut the price further. That would lead to losses, and I guess we can assume that predatory pricing is not going to work here. So that situation is a Nash equilibrium. The result, if we illustrated it in a standard diagram, says that the firms are going to split the total demand in the market. The total amount sold is going to be what I just call here the competitive quantity, the amount that the buyers would like to purchase at the competitive price. And at that price, the firms are just covering their costs. So in this model, it's assumed that either there's only variable costs, and those variable costs are constant, or we could also assume that the firms have had enough time to adjust their fixed costs so that all costs, in effect, can be varied in the long term. And those costs can just be described as constant. In other words, to produce an additional unit of output, the firms will just pay an additional amount so that marginal costs are constant, not rising, not decreasing. Well, we then spent some time looking at the prisoner's dilemma model, which has some resemblances to the Bertrand oligopoly model. In this case, the firms are setting their prices at the same time, and the critical feature was that they just set their price once. And in the simple example I looked at, the firms can choose just two prices. We could call it a high price, like a monopoly price, or a low price. And the possible outcomes were shown in a payoff matrix. The payoffs in this case being the profits that each firm would expect given a combination of strategies. So just to run over this one more time, this picture is telling us, in this case, the two strategies that firm 1 could choose, low price or high price, and these are the two strategies that firm 2 could choose. Each of these boxes then represents the outcomes for each firm given the combination of strategies. So this box here represents the outcomes if firm 2 chooses the low price and firm 1 chooses the high price. And if you just look at the numbers, you could tell yourself a little story. Firm 2 chooses a low price. This is saying it's getting high profits. Firm 1 is losing money. Presumably what's happened is that firm 2 has taken away a lot of firm 1's customers, leaving it with a loss. Well, we worked through the logic of this prisoner's dilemma to figure out just what each firm ought to do given the strategies that the other firm could choose. And the logic that we came up with was that in this case, each firm would choose a low price. And we went through a couple of exercises, and I've posted the solutions to those exercises in a separate file on D2L. So that's the critical feature of the prisoner's dilemma, is that in this case, the firms can't cooperate. They end up choosing a low price. You can see that total profits are only 9 in total, divided up between the two firms. And somehow, if only they could have charged a high price, they would have enjoyed much higher profits. But somehow the logic of decision-making for each firm led them to this low-price situation. So that was the dilemma. The firms would like to be here, but they end up here. Of course, the buyers, their customers, are happy that they ended up here, as opposed to facing high prices in this market. Okay, well, that's just a review of what we looked at in the lecture. Now what I want to do is to consider ways in which the firms might overcome this dilemma that they faced in the prisoner's dilemma situation. So let's turn to that in the next video.